Hello, and welcome to the Cadre Journal. I'm Joseph, and Merrick can say hello
Hello.
as well. We're joined today by Calla Walsh. It's a really, really excited to have you here and discuss a little bit more about youth anti-imperialism, solidarity work with Cuba and with Palestine. But before getting started, Calla, if you would like to introduce yourself, and then we can start asking questions.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Calla Walsh. I'm from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm currently living in Montreal, Quebec, attending McGill University, where I'm studying history and French. And I've been involved in politics since I was 15. I started out working in the youth climate strike and the climate movement. I worked on a lot of Democratic campaigns and progressive primary challenger campaigns, but very much became disillusioned with, establishment machine politics and was pushed into a much more revolutionary anti-imperialism, which kind of defines the organizing I've been doing for the past year or two or so. So right now I'm involved in the Palestine solidarity movement, as well as the Cuba solidarity movement, through some local groups here in Montreal and in Boston. And I was also just elected as one of the co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, which I think we'll talk about in a bit, but that's a coalition of all the Cuba solidarity organizations that are active in the US. So yeah, thanks again for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Awesome, and it's a pleasure to have you. And I think we can pick up right there in maybe kind of a preemptory question and going into discussing about Cuba a little bit, which is, as you just mentioned, making that transition from electoral organizing, youth politics, as it's commonly discussed, to anti-imperialism, to a kind of radical solidarity, which has a horizon of liberation. I'm really fascinated by that. I think Merrick and I, we've talked a little bit before, and we talked with the Guerrilla History podcast a bit about making that transition ourselves and kind of emerging to a degree, I guess, waking up, you could say, almost out of a sort of reformist or electoral politics. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about your experience with that and what made you move towards anti-imperialism as the exigency of your politics rather than continuing with what I think is like the very limited horizons of what is otherwise discussed as youth politics. I know that that's often within this kind of like youth are the future. We know everything. Like we're especially in the climate movement, that's typically how it's presented. Or whether it's against gun violence or any kind of youth-centric movement, typically frames things that way. But I wonder if we could almost reflect on like the degree to which sometimes as young people, as students, we are always in the process of learning actually, and sometimes we are very susceptible to opportunism, careerism, the other things that limit our politics. So I wonder if you could reflect on that a bit, and how it helped you sort of wake up from that and move towards anti-imperialism.
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think moving towards anti-imperialism was kind of inevitable because I think contradictions inevitably rose because of the work that I was doing while still considering myself a progressive, a socialist, anti-capitalist, whatever labels, I felt like fit for me, um, while also working in these establishment spaces, working for candidates like Democrats who are really good at talking the talk, and making themselves seem really progressive, and maybe even being progressive, at least domestically, while still supporting US imperialism and genocides and wars and interventions abroad. So the specific turning point where that happened for me was after I'd worked for US Senator Ed Markey's campaign, which I got involved in March 2020 as a student organizer, and worked with a group of my friends to kind of help build a youth movement to reelect him because he was being challenged from the right by a Kennedy And Markey was the co-author of the Green New Deal, which to us was a really important policy priority, because, fighting climate change was important to us as young people. Looking back and having much more critical thought, the Green New Deal is not an end all be all to climate change. It is kind of green imperialism and will not actually, address how colonialism and imperialism and capitalism are at the very root of the climate crisis. But anyways, we worked for this candidate. We kind of transformed how he was considered as a politician. We became the first campaign to defeat a Kennedy in the state of Massachusetts, and went like very viral. And it was a lot, and we had a lot to benefit from as people working from his for his campaign. We got media attention, we got career opportunities. We were very close to this senator and his office and his campaign staff, and in that position of power. But we also didn't think enough about Markey's actual positions beyond those that directly concerned us during the campaign. For example, his foreign policy stances. Markey has a really bad record on Palestine, and that was kind of brushed under the rug during the campaign because Kennedy was only slightly worse than him on those issues. And after he was elected, he quickly took some stances that we some of us really disagreed with. For example, he voted against condemning or changing Trump's decision to make the U.S. embassy in occupied Palestine in Jerusalem, further legitimizing the Israeli occupation. And then in April and May 2021, during the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and the Israeli siege on Gaza, he put out some tweets and a statement, basically both siding the situation, saying that the Israeli occupation had the right to defend itself from the decolonial Palestinian resistance. And to me, that was a really big turning point, realizing how I had been so siloed on this issue of electing a senator who was good on climate, who was promoting the Green New Deal, while completely ignoring that he was actually just as imperialist and capitalist as any other US politician is. So we started a public pressure campaign. We collected thousands of signatures to try to change his mind on this issue, to get him to take a better stance. That got a lot of media attention, ended up in a meeting directly with his Senate office, where we basically asked politely, can you please stop supporting genocide? And they said, no, like there's nothing we can do, or we'll get back to you on our position, which is how pretty much every legislative meeting I've been in goes, but especially when you're trying to push something anti-imperialist. And the demands we were asking were very minimal demands, such as conditioning military aid to the Israeli occupation based on their human rights violations. We weren't even asking them to, support the Palestinian resistance or to, support the full liberation of Palestine. So after that, I think I was very much radicalized, both by seeing how these politicians could, make commitments to young people on certain issues, but ultimately were just loyal to the pro-Israel lobby, to their Zionist donors. And I also was radicalized by having gone through this whole pressure campaign, trying to, ask a politician, putting individual pressure on them to change their stance, and having it not work at all. And I think that made me see both the futile nature of, trying to just use these electoral systems to make changes, when really just operating within these systems often further legitimizes them and really limits our framework and what we can say and how honest we can be about the issues that we are trying to address. So after that, I ended up getting much more involved in the Palestine solidarity movement, because it was both just important to me as an issue, of course, and as someone living under a government who is responsible for the Israeli occupation's continuance, giving millions and millions of dollars to the occupation a day. But also I felt, a personal obligation, having worked for Markey, who is now back in the Senate, upholding the occupation. So I joined BDS, Boston, and I ended up stepping back from a lot of the political organizing work I'd been doing, in electoral politics in Massachusetts, and committed myself to doing political education and really trying to unlearn a lot of the imperialist propaganda that I had absorbed throughout my lifetime living in the United States, being educated by the U.S. education system, and also to reconsider how my position as someone who had been staffed and employed and paid by these Democratic campaigns had compromised my own ability to see what was right and wrong and to understand, imperialism when it was right in front of me. So I think in a broader sense, young people often come into organizing spaces with really radical ideas and radical intentions. And unfortunately, often the options that exist for us to be organized are de-radicalizing. And especially when young people are considering getting involved in politics as a career option, they look to campaigns, they look to Capitol Hill, and no revolutionary change is going to happen by just pursuing a career for your own benefit in those spaces. That's just a fact. So to me, I think when I look back, I can really see how even when I entered the climate movement, I considered myself an anti-capitalist. I considered myself an anti-imperialist, but all the work that I was doing showed such big contradictions with those actual ideas. And only when I committed myself to disrupting these systems and not just working within them, trying to change them from within, but to be also working outside them and attacking them and disrupting them. And of course, I think there is still, some strategic potential in terms of trying to subvert systems from within. But when that is the only sole focus of your work, it's not productive at all. And I think we really need to look at how the NGO, the nonprofit industrial complex, the NGOization of a lot of our activism in the imperial core and in any capitalist society serves to de-radicalize and disempower the actual impact of the work that we are doing.
Definitely agreed. And I think, Merrick and I have talked a lot about this as well. Like I was very involved with sort of Bernie Sanders kind of like progressive work for a while. And immediately afterward, it was kind of questioning stuff like the Green New Deal, the kind of entryist politics that we have in a lot of progressive spaces in the US, and even just generally thinking about like the limitations of a non anti-imperialist perspective, like one that is just trying to build socialism in the context of the United States without any thought about, the US as an empire domestic in its domestic occupations and overseas. And that was the kind of thing that prompted me and other people that I've talked to of kind of like straying away from this. So I think it definitely ends up being, how do you challenge this overwhelming complex of progressive NGOs, of the industry of working in campaigns that come with a lot of benefits, especially in an age where, people are thinking a little bit more, I think, in terms of like careerism about how they're going to pay off their student loan debt than they are about the most kind of radical change that they can help promote. So yeah, I don't know. Do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, just to follow up quickly, I think that's so right. And like I mentioned on the Markey campaign, one thing that was really interesting to me was during this surge of support for the petition we were collecting signatures for, thousands of people signed, many people who had worked on the campaign, staff members, interns, volunteers, but after the attention kind of faded, many of those people went back to working for the same guy. They went to intern or staff in his Senate office, or they continued working for his campaign or other Democrats who had the same exact positions. So I think it's also a problem with people who only take stances when there's pressure to, when everyone's posting an Instagram infographic about it. So you feel the need to say something or to change your position. but when it comes down to it, you will go ahead and compromise your principles, your alleged principles, again for your own career benefit. And I think I can understand why people do things to an extent when they need to pay the bills and when they need to get their paychecks. But as people living in the imperial core, we have a choice of whether we are choosing to like directly participate in these systems and to directly fund literal genocides. Like that's not an exaggeration in any way. Like the work by working for imperialist politicians and by advocating for these institutions that fund the Israeli occupation, supporting a literal genocide. And I don't think there's any excuse for that. And unfortunately, like I think also interpersonal pressure plays a big role in that too. It was really hard having to step back. I lost a lot of friends and people I'd worked with for a long time because I was criticizing this politician who a lot of us had formed this like weird parasocial relationship to and stand and idolized. But I think really maintaining a clear perspective about like the material forces at play and the material implications of the work we are doing made that less harder for me because I knew that stepping back was right. And it was hard. I got backlash on social media. I got backlash from friends and former coworkers. But ultimately, like I know that I made the right choice in doing that. And I think, like I said, staying grounded in what is actually the material result of the work that we're doing is really, really important because I couldn't, ignore that any longer.
Yeah. Um, it's interesting that you mentioned like the social dynamics of these things, because I feel like that's really important. I know for Joseph was kind of on the side, like when we were in high school, he was on the electoralism side. He was really into the campaigns and he knew all the candidates and all these things. And I was more on the like not even bookish side. Like I was just, more interested in
You were
in
reading Mao in high school.
anti-imperialism.
Like, yeah, you already had it. I was like, who's running in the primary? Merrick's like, hey,
Yeah.
Little Red Book. Yeah.
Yeah, you read the Little Red Book. So Joseph and I kind of had that, that relationship of contradiction that allowed us both to grow. And so I wanted to ask you to maybe expand a little bit more on those social factors, not only about the pushback and the loss of friendships and kind of like the changing of your social environment, but maybe also some of the good things and the community that you're building now with other principled anti-imperialist socialists. I would love for you to comment more on that, particularly young people, but I think of course older comrades and all other parts of the community are very important. But if you could talk about that, the good parts, and also if you experience any difficulties within those communities or just difficulties in general being part of those organizing groups, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess to start with, like the worst stuff I experienced and then to go to the positive. Like I said, I kind of stepped back from a lot of the electoral politics, the electoral organizing that I was doing as I started to raise my anti-imperialist consciousness. And I think that was also because as I radicalized, as I became a Marxist, as I started, learning about systems of exploitation and alienation and how that impacts our everyday lives. I realized how exploited I had been in a lot of the organizing spaces that I had been working in, both through, like exploitation of my labor. My friends and I performed so much unpaid labor for the Markey campaign and for many, many other causes. And our passion, our excitement was really taken advantage of by a lot of higher ups in these spaces to just get us to do a lot of work for them without like getting paid for it. And also abuse, like sexual abuse from people in organizations that I worked with was also a factor that I became aware that I suddenly realized I'd been experiencing as I radicalized. And becoming a communist actually really helped me realize the ways that I had been abused because I saw how they were reflective of, the broader systems that we are living in. And then I, stepped back from these spaces, and that really helps me. And since I've gotten like back more intensively into organizing, I have tried to be intentional about, avoiding those same things, not burning myself out, although burnout is, I don't know, just I don't even like the term burnout, because I think it's just an inevitable result of like capitalist exploitation, but not overloading myself with organizing commitments, and still taking time for myself, and not letting my amount of work alienate me from myself, from my loved ones, from the things that make me human, was really, really important. And finding comrades who supported me through that, and who I could organize with and really trust, and feel protected by, was absolutely transformative. I'd say, I know we're going to talk about my experience in Cuba in a bit, but I'd say Cuba is probably the space that I felt that the most. I went with a delegation from the US, but we were staying at a camp that had been constructed by volunteers, from hundreds of volunteers from countries around the world. There were about 200 people there or so from like 30 different countries. And we all lived together for almost 2 weeks on this camp, together every day, sharing rooms, going about our lives together and doing work together. And I'd never felt like more at home, and more comradeship than I did then. And I think that was definitely reflective of how this completely different construction of society and of, the means of production in Cuba, has also manifested itself in the values that people hold and in the ways that they interact with each other. Which was very, collectivist and community oriented and centered around love and care, and not, extraction and exploitation, like we see so much under capitalism. I think the way that we interact in our interpersonal relationships and how we treat each other is, of course, like reflective of the systems that we live in. And unfortunately, that means, a lot of the abuses that we experience in capitalism, the ways we are dehumanized by capitalism, are often reflected in the ways we treat others and interact in social situations. And so experiencing that in a completely different way in Cuba, seeing how socialism and revolution can be manifested in how we treat each other, was incredible. We saw that in how they treated COVID, for example. Everyone was still wearing masks outside when I went to Cuba, even though they had the highest vaccination rate in the world. And in the US, no one was wearing masks when I went, even in the airport. And of course, I think that it has a lot to do with the efficacy of Cuba's education and science, and health systems, but it also has to do with the fact that communities care about each other, and people are there to support each other and to protect each other. And in the US, we are very fractured and alienated from each other, and there's not that same sense of collective struggle or collective care, because capitalism pits against each other, because capitalism drains everything out of us so that we only have time and energy to think about providing for ourselves. So that was a long-winded answer, but I think my point is that it's important to not just look within, but look outside of ourselves and see how our surrounding conditions have changed us, have humanized or dehumanized us, depending on the context, and to really, analyze how we can change our behavior, and try to treat each other in more humanist, more revolutionary ways, so that we aren't replicating the same systems of oppression that we're trying to dismantle.
I think your comments about Cuba are um, really spot on, and really insightful for your own experience. And to me, it's amazing that you were able to go to Cuba at such a young age, that you had that kind of um, knowledge and access. Because for me here in Miami, I do like some Cuba work with the Cuba Caravan. We have some organizations here that are, very active in, protesting the blockade, protesting the embargo. And I find that those groups have been, really beneficial for me to find like-minded people, like-minded comrades. It is definitely here like a large tent type of organization. There's people from all different areas, different backgrounds, Cubans, non-Cubans, Americans, people from all over. Um, but I still find that everyone who goes to Cuba is definitely touched in a very, profound way. And when they come back, they have a very, communal sense. They're people that I organize with are very in tuned with how people are feeling. Make sure that people feel heard. And in their organizing work, they're always trying to do more, which I just find very, insightful. And I'm glad that you're able to find those similar communities. And I wanted to ask, talking about all this, how did you get into Cuba solidarity work? What was kind of the path to you actually going to Cuba? I know Joseph and I are trying to plan our first trip to Cuba as well. So, talking about that, yeah, feel free to go into whatever.
Yeah, that's so exciting to hear you guys might be planning a trip to Cuba. Yeah, I got involved in the Cuba Solidarity movement less than a year ago. I didn't even know there was a Boston Cuba Solidarity Coalition until a comrade of mine told me about it. Someone that I'd worked with on some legislative advocacy in 2021. And I went to my first meeting in January. I immediately felt like I was welcomed into a family of these organizers who have really devoted their lives to Cuba Solidarity organizing. Many people who have been traveling there for decades. And the reason I went to Cuba was because one of the members of our coalition, a woman named Mary, who lives in Massachusetts half the year and in Havana half the year, reached out to me and encouraged me to really, really go on the May Day Brigade, which is the brigade that the National Network on Cuba runs every year from late April to early May. And she had gone on the very first US Solidarity Brigade to Cuba, which was the Venceremos Brigade in 1969, if I'm not mistaken. And that transformed her life. Of course, now she's living part-time in Cuba, and she encouraged me to go. And I said, I have no idea if my parents will let me or if I'll be able to miss school or if I can afford this, but I want to go. I knew I really wanted to go. And I got very involved in the Solidarity Coalition. We led some what ended up being national fundraising to raise money to support scholarships for more young people to go on the brigade. My parents were fine with it, thankfully, and I got permission from my school to, miss some classes, and I ended up using the brigade as part of my senior graduation project, which was a great way to actually enable me to go. And then I went at the end of April, and it was a really, really incredible experience. Yeah, the solidarity brigades to the US or between the US and Cuba have existed since the 60s and 70s, starting with the Venceremos Brigade. And back then, and even still now in some ways, they faced a lot of repression from the US government, which I think goes to show just how important traveling to Cuba and learning from the Cuban people and bringing back the truth to the United States is. The blockade exists not just for economic reasons, but it also exists to prevent us from people-to-people contact with Cuba. It's not just a blockade of trade, but it's also a blockade of culture, of information, of people. And I think in general too, if the US empire is really set on not letting Americans travel to a country, usually it's a sign that we should, or that we should at least, figure out what's going on there if they don't want us to see it. So I think the two main reasons that going on a solidarity brigade, just traveling to Cuba, is important, and kind of the goals of the brigades are, one, seeing the effects of the blockade and of all US policy on Cuba, to really understand how US sanctions are genocidal and are hurting the Cuban people and preventing them from, letting their revolution develop and reaching its full potential. So then we can come home and tell the truth about that and fight those policies. And that's really important because when you see pictures of Cuba on Twitter or wherever, you see long lines of food, you see crumbling buildings, you see fuel shortages, you see electricity outages, and the US media and the US government all wants you to think that that's because of socialism, that socialism just doesn't work, so there's no electricity, which doesn't make any sense, but a lot of people believe. When in reality, those obstacles and difficulties all exist because of the blockade, and socialism is the only reason that Cubans have been able to survive and do so well and have a higher life expectancy than the US despite the blockade. So I think that's a really key understanding. And I think the other main reason why it's important for people from the US, especially young people, to go to Cuba is to see the effects of the Cuban Revolution and what it is like to build socialism in its actuality, so we can come home and fight for our own revolution here. So things we did on the brigade that especially were impactful were visiting local industries, meeting with workers, hearing about the obstacles posed by the blockade. For example, we visited a truck factory where they were constructing buses that are used for like public transportation, and the public transportation levels in Havana right now, or at least when I went, were at 40% of what they were pre-pandemic because of fuel shortages and because of the additional sanctions that Trump put on and the difficulties caused by the pandemic. They're not able to even buy the little spare parts that they need to attach wheels and to build buses. And that is the only reason why that there aren't, enough buses to transport people on the streets. We also visited a biotech center where they had developed, I believe, 5 or 6 of Cuba's own COVID vaccines, which is an incredible feat because throughout the pandemic, the really genocidal nature of the US blockade was shown by the fact that the US prevented Cuba from importing materials that they needed to develop their vaccines. They even prevented them from buying oxygen during the pandemic to help people who had COVID. And Fidel, during the special period in the 90s, was very intentional about investing in the biotech and technology and science sectors because he knew that that was how Cuba could get the resources that it needed during this really, really hard economic downturn after the dissolution of the USSR and as the US blockade was tightening. Because, Cuba has always had such strong investments in education and science since the revolution. He knew that was an area that, despite all the obstacles Cuba faced, they could really exceed what other countries were doing. And both, selling their innovations, their biotechnological innovations and medications that they've created has been a source of income for the country, as well as sending medical brigades to other countries to support them. So that was really interesting to learn about. I'd say also, connecting directly with Cuban youth was such a powerful experience of the trip. Because we all are just young people, we have a lot in common, but also parts of our lives are extremely different, based on whether you live in the imperial core or whether you live in a country that is one of the most hated enemies of US imperialism. One of the friends that I made on that trip who I'm still in touch with, Diana Castillo, she is part of the international department of the UJC, which is the Young Communist League in Cuba. And I learned from her experience during her voluntary military service when she was around 18 and 19. She served at Guantanamo. And I also got to visit Guantanamo for a conference on abolishing military bases while I was there. And to hear from someone who was at the time that they served in their voluntary service, and at the time I was there, just a year or two older than me, talk about serving at the border of the Guantanamo naval base literally willing to go up in arms against the biggest empire and most powerful military in the history of the earth to defend their revolution was really powerful. That's not, a reality for nearly any, I don't think any young people in the US. I mean, which young people in the US would willingly just go up in arms, for their country because they really believe, in, like something great about the US, that or that we're somehow under attack. So to hear from that direct perspective was really important, and also to see how Cuban young people use, social media and other forms of organizing to tell their truth, and to try to fight back against Western propaganda about Cuba, was really significant. I guess the last thing I'll share is that this one anecdote I saw in a documentary really stuck out to me, and I think kind of exemplifies like why it's so important to travel to Cuba. And this was from a member of the Weather Underground, actually, Kathy Boudin, in a documentary that I watched about her trip to Cuba. I believe she was 17, and she talked about how they were at a parade and some military tanks drove through and everyone was clapping, and then she realized that she was clapping for tanks and for a military, which back home, in her leftist family in New York, were always things that she had been taught were bad and that were wrong, and that, we need to stand against militarism. And the Cuban man next to her turned to her and said, we don't like having these weapons and having these means of destruction either, but your country is the only reason that we have to have them. And that really has stuck with me since I watched that, and I think is exactly why we need to go to Cuba, is to understand, the violences of the US blockade, of not just the blockade, but also of the warfare, both indirect and direct, that the US has been waging on Cuba since they accomplished their revolution and overthrew US neocolonialism, is really important, because US policy has defined all the actions that Cuba has had to take and not been able to take since then.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm so glad that you brought up a lot of elements of Cuban history, because I feel like that is really one of the greatest benefits for like young people in the US, especially Marxists, to think about is, how the revolution has developed, how it started, how it went through, whether it be through the special period or today, or during the 70s, 60s. There's so many elements that we can look towards as, areas to learn from. I know for me in particular, I think a lot about Cuba's revolutionary solidarity with movements in Africa, whether they, the fighting in Angola, or, Shea's support for movements in the Congo, and, all around just this principled support of all the movements which were against apartheid, colonialism, imperialism. I mean, Cuba has so much to give to us when it comes to the history of solidarity work and the history of the development of a revolution and the way we can move towards socialism. So I'm really glad that you brought up, the different elements, being in Cuba, seeing, how young people were, fighting imperialism, being literally at the border of Guantanamo, fighting, standing up against imperialism, which the U.S. conducts on the island. I wanted to quickly comment on that and bring up, that we've done some conversations with people who did research on Cuba's involvement in Angola in previous episodes. And I know Joseph wants to talk a little bit about Palestine next, but I wanted to thank you for your comments on Cuba.
Thanks. Sorry, I just realized, you asked about how I got involved in the Cuba Solidarity movement, and I talked about how I got involved in the Solidarity organization, but my first actual introduction to Cuba was actually reading the autobiography of Asada Shakur, an escaped political prisoner from the US who has lived in Cuba since her liberation. And of course, I'd like heard of Cuba, didn't know much about it. I'd heard all, the US propaganda points before then. But then when I read her autobiography and heard about her experience as a revolutionary in the US, being repressed by, the FBI's COINTELPRO program, being locked in a cage, and then being liberated by her comrades and escaping to Cuba, the way she wrote about Cuba was an incredible contrast to the US. And she wrote this decades ago, but about how their society had already, taken steps towards massively changing, problems that will probably exist in the US, for much longer than they had in Cuba. Racism. She talked about how different it was addressed in Cuba versus in the US, and how she felt like she was in the first place where she actually felt like her race, wasn't the first thing that people saw about her, and how it was a community where people actually lived, in connection and solidarity and care for each other, like I was all talking about earlier. And I think that's really important too to think about. My first introduction to Cuba was the perspective of a political prisoner from the U.S. who got asylum in Cuba. Most things that the U.S. says about its enemies are actually true about the U.S. And the U.S. preaches about human rights violations and political prisoners in Cuba, when the reality is that political prisoners from the US have escaped and been liberated in Cuba and are protected by the Cuban Revolution. And the reality is that the human rights violations that are happening in Cuba are in the territory that's occupied by the US, where they operate the most brutal human rights torture camp, or most brutal torture camp and violator of human rights in the world, at Guantanamo Bay. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that first. Definitely recommend Asato's autobiography and learning about the linked history between liberation struggles within the US empire and Cuba.
Yeah, completely agree with that in terms of Asada's narrative and kind of what she helps expose about the United States, and kind of discussing her refuge in Cuba is like the only society that will take her in. And still to this day, I know I sent it to Merrick, and I just finished listening to it, but there's this new podcast that came out, which is it's about the Weather Underground, and they kind of talk about Asada, of course, as like the role they played in her liberation, and it's really interesting to hear her experience in Cuba as being so positive, as the U.S. government still, irrespective of what president we have, what kind of Congress we have, however many progressive whatever there are in the U.S. government, she will always be on the FBI's top wanted list. And I think that's a very revealing fact about this country. But I feel like just listening to even you kind of describe going to Cuba and seeing it for yourself, it's really fascinating to me because as we were talking about in the outset, Merrick and I grew up in South Florida. We got the whole treatment of really like the most reactionary stuff you could imagine in high school, just in terms of what people were telling us vicariously about, like, this is the reality of Cuba. And I feel like that was part of our political awakening, as well as just like unlearning that lie first, that like what the American education system tells you about Cuba is not true, and being able to go and find out about it for yourself is like a huge first step in kind of learning. And I think especially in the time now where we're so exposed to, as young people on the internet, especially this kind of very odious form of like social media imperialism, where things are conducted through disinformation, through Instagram infographics. Like, I think that is really, information has always been, but has definitely become through the internet a huge method of warfare. In a hybrid war against Cuba, I think we have to be very aware of like the type of media we consume, even the type of narratives we get about Cuba. But so it's super interesting to learn more about. But yeah, I did want to just kind of bring in the discussion of Palestine as well, to put it into context with all of the work that you do, and especially to talk a little bit about like some of my own experiences with it, but I think sort of like student experiences in general with pro-Palestine work. Um, I'm sure you're familiar with and perhaps are on Canary Mission. We've talked about that, yeah. So it's like one of those things where I think pro-Palestine work becomes a kind of unique student experience, because it is centered around universities in the United States, has this huge backlash through this kind of this real kind of like watch list that is put out by this organization. Although personally, yeah, so you can just like drop the link of a Canary Mission in the chat. What's really cool to me about Canary Mission is like reading them now, with like the right political education. You know, if I had read them in high school, I would have been like, oh, whoa, I should stay away from this person. But reading them now, I'm like, oh, this is like your top tweets right here. This is like the best things you've ever said, all in one place. And I've heard people say like they use Canary Mission to meet comrades, you know, because it's like people who are put on there for a reason. But I think it's really fascinating because I have never personally experienced like any kind of backlash like that where you are fully doxxed, like they go get all of your stuff put online. It's a very severe form of intimidation. Of course, nothing comparable to what Palestinian comrades face, but it to me it's just interesting to reflect on through your and I was curious to kind of talk about your experience in totality of working in pro-Palestine work, how as a student it can be really, really difficult in the US context, which is so anti-Palestine, and really prevents students from like even giving this kind of Palestinian liberation sentiment. Like the best you get from a lot of progressive groups is a kind of tentative, we support the two-state solution, whatever. But I'm curious to hear more about that. Also, how you got involved, and just kind of your reflections on it now.
Yeah, I think you're very right about getting doxxed. It was pretty crazy, but I think that doxing, the purpose of it kind of backfires because it further radicalizes whoever is being doxed and also kind of empowers us more to say whatever we believe without a filter, and gives, further power to the words that we're saying, because they're receiving so much backlash from groups like Canary Mission. And I wasn't actually, like endangered by getting doxxed like so many Palestinians are, who are fired from work, who are like kicked out of schools, prevented from returning to their homeland. And um I'll just say, like, Canary Mission, I didn't even realize I was on there until a couple weeks after it had been posted. That was kind of underwhelming because most of like the backlash I'd received and the doxing had happened back in June, when the mapping project was released. And the mapping project is an incredible, incredible project and resource that I really encourage people to check out. I didn't work directly on this project at all. I just helped promote it on social media once it was released because I found it to be an incredible tool for the work that I was doing. And as a member of BDS Boston, I especially felt it was important to support as we are trying to identify, how our local institutions are complicit, whether it's direct or indirect. And most people who were criticizing the mapping project and calling it anti-Semitic had no idea what it actually was and haven't even actually looked at it. So I definitely encourage people to check it out. It's mapliberation.org. Of course, it is a map of Massachusetts, but I think it's still a really important tool for anyone, and it's really interesting for anyone to look at, to see how, carceral systems, policing, prisons in the US are connected to imperialism abroad, are connected to the military industrial complex and weapons manufacturers and universities who are complicit doing research, scientific institutions, think tanks, that even like high schools are part of these systems. So yeah, I think that the mapping project, the amount of backlash that it got shows exactly how important that it was. Um, and the institutions that were criticizing it were mostly just mad because they were on there and they didn't want to be called out for their complicity in the genocide of Palestine and in other, racist and carceral oppression. But yeah, I got involved in Palestine solidarity organizing when this whole public pressure campaign on Senator Markey occurred, and that was how I got connected to some organizations that I still work with, like BDS Boston and Massachusetts Peace Action. And I think when I started getting involved, there is a lot of liberal Zionism that is still present in pro-Palestine, and I put that in quotes, organizations. Um, and a lot of that serves to co-opt the actual solidarity organizing and to kind of water down what the calls are coming from Palestinians on the ground. And I'm not like the best person to speak on this, but I have definitely like been lucky enough to have comrades who have educated me, and I can recommend resources. Like one resource that I'd really recommend people start subscribing to and reading every day is the Resistance News Network, because so much of the solidarity movement in the imperial core and in the West is not vocal enough about supporting the resistance and supporting Palestinians using every means that they have available to resist their genocide and the Israeli occupation. So Resistance News Network was started by some comrades who had been getting censored on Twitter and Instagram, and it's a Telegram channel. You can subscribe to it at t.me/Palestine Resist, and they post constant updates of what is happening from Palestine on the ground with the resistance, with the constant repression, increasing repression of the Zionist occupation. And that has been like an incredible resource to learn about and to stay subscribed to, because so much of what we learn about in the imperial core about Palestine is filtered through many, imperialist news channels and liberal Zionist organizations before it actually gets to us. So I think staying connected to what's happening on the ground is something I've realized is so, so important as we engage in Palestine solidarity work. Yeah, I think Palestine, once you kind of understand what is at stake there, I'd always been taught that it's too complicated for me to understand, that, the history is of thousands of years and I just shouldn't take on a stance on it because it's too controversial. And once I actually, realized that it's quite simple, it's quite simple to understand colonization. It's pretty obvious when it's happening and when settlers are going and invading people's communities and violently kicking them out. That is settler colonialism in action. And once you understand that framework for Palestine, and to see how the US empire is funneling billions of dollars to Israel, because to the Israeli occupation, because not only do they support their colonization of Palestine, but also because it is a harbinger for US imperialism and US interests with other countries in the Middle East as well. I think that understanding that framework, you can then apply it to any other country and any other enemy of US imperialism. So to me, learning about Palestine was kind of an entry into understanding the anti-imperialist struggle as a whole. And like you mentioned, there's history of solidarity between Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, and the Palestinian Revolution. There's a strong history of solidarity between, the Irish struggle for freedom from British colonization and for unification that has been very directly tied with the Palestinian liberation struggle. So seeing how internationalism is present in all these movements has been really, really important as well.
Yeah. I think, the internationalism that you talked about is super important. And Joseph and I talk about this a lot, where normally Palestine is like that very beginner litmus test. It's like you can really tell a lot about someone based on like how they think about Palestine, and it's not just like, are you pro-Palestine, or, where you fall in this, but it's also like how you think about the conflict that's actually going on. And the US's complicity and support of the Israeli occupation. But I kind of wanted to go more into kind of the youth elements that we've talked about. We're all college students here. Cadre is really an organization dedicated to giving students a platform to, promote anti-imperialism, to learn together, in a communal way, in the way of solidarity. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some of the, obstacles and barriers that, us as young people have to connect with other young people to, promote an ideology that is in line with, restorative justice, with Marxism, with all these different issues which are so heavily attacked by, the whether it be the military industrial complex with engineers and people getting brought into the CIA and all these different elements which are constantly attacking just like basic human rights. I would love for you to kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think this is on the mind since there's this post that's been going around like today and yesterday, but I think the war of ideas, as some people put it, is really being fought on social media. And unfortunately, a lot of young people are getting their only education about geopolitics on social media and through like Instagram infographics. And specifically, there's this post that's been going around about how the Iranian government supposedly executed 15,000 protesters that like dozens of people have been reposting. That's just blatantly false. Like even Justin Trudeau tweeted it and then deleted it because it's literally fake news. It's just not true. A couple protesters, one or two, were sentenced to death, and more are incarcerated, but 15,000 people have not been executed. And of course, the way these are framed is in a way that progressive young people, people with good intentions for the most part, who really do care about human rights and really do like want liberation for oppressed peoples. These kind of like CIA psyops really co-opt that radical progressive language, that kind of framing, put it on like a pretty flowery Canva infographic and put it on Instagram and get dozens and hundreds of thousands, millions of people to repost misinformation and manufacture consent for regime change and for Western intervention and Western imperialism. We saw that with July 11th as well. There are all these Instagram protests all these Instagram posts going around saying SOS Cuba, we need to liberate Cuba, which people might feel good posting about because they're saying, oh, I'm just, helping these people on the streets who are protesting, when really what they're doing is supporting an agenda that is being used for justification for military intervention. Around July 11th, there's literally politicians in South Florida saying we need to go like send, airplanes and like bomb Cuba. Like we need to bomb Havana. That's crazy. And that's awful. And like people don't realize that them just posting a social media post with supposedly good intentions can help uphold that and can like indirectly or directly breed support for Western imperialism. So I think, like I said, the war of ideas is being fought on social media. I think we really need to be putting out content and political education of high quality about anti-imperialism and about all these issues. And we also need to be doing a lot of education offline. We need to be reading. We need to be in discussion with each other and not just learning on social media. I think social media has important purposes and can be like a good discussion space, especially for sharing news rapidly. But if that is the full extent of your political education, that's really dangerous. So I think we need to be doing all of that because political education and actually like stepping back from just trying to work all the time and realizing, wait, do I even know like what my own ideas are and what I think about my orientation to the world is really important. Within the US, we are really never taught to think about ourselves in relation to other countries. This goes back even to the way we're taught about the American Revolution. Like we all suddenly just like decided to like be a country and unite around this American identity and like fight the British, when it was way more complicated than that and actually had to do with like a lot of different like international interests and support that enabled like the US colonies to be independent. So that is just like an example of the entirety of our history and how I think we really have this like siloed view where we just think about like ourselves and our own issues, and when we think about other countries it's to post like a savioristic infographic and not wondering about, oh, maybe like we do live in the most powerful empire in the world and that like the stuff that our government is promoting and saying has actual implications. And the thing is, like, young people can understand when the US government is lying to them about police brutality, about COVID, about being able to forgive student debt, about all this. So why aren't they questioning the US government in the same way when they're saying things about other countries, especially enemies of US imperialism? So I think also drawing the connections between these domestic issues that young people are already passionate about and radicalized about, like, you know, fighting police brutality, like fighting climate change, and showing how those things are not possible unless they are also opposed to US imperialism. Another example is gun violence. Like, young people care a lot about gun violence and ending school shootings. Like, the US is the biggest arms manufacturer and exporter in the entire world. That's why shootings and violence are such a big problem here. And not being able to see those issues as interconnected is exactly what, you know, the state and the ruling class wants. So I think there's a lot of education to be done, but I think so many young people like have revolutionary potential and are on the right track, and it's a matter of making sure our content and our ideas are getting to them and making them see, letting them see past, you know, the imperialist propaganda.
Just to comment a little bit, I think that you make a lot of great points about the connections. I think a lot of young people, while they might be, very passionate about certain things, it's like, whether it be, climate change or, gun violence or, healthcare. I think that, what the biggest, or even, imperialism to some extent, some people are concerned with, demilitarization, but I think what people don't have, what a lot of young people don't have is the actual viewpoint of how, the mode of production, and capitalism in totality creates, develops, and promotes all of these issues, whether it be, imperialism or it be, the destruction of the climate or the environment or any of these other issues, which as Marxists, we can understand that there's a structure and a connection between these different issues inherent in the way that, commodity production and, revenue production are all related to each other. We can see that. And so when you talk about, education, that's what I'm thinking about. And I'm thinking about, when I go into my reading groups, whether it be through Cadre or with other comrades, I'm always thinking about how we are developing that idea of that interplay of different issues, how the mode of production, just like Lenin said, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, how these different levels of capitalism, different facets of capitalism all affect our lives, and how that those different elements, which young people are aware of but aren't actually understanding of how they're all connected, how we can use those smaller elements to radicalize people and push them to a bigger understanding.
I mean, just picking up exactly on what you just said was what I was thinking in terms of like the problem we have, I think, as young people to be very susceptible in response. Like, we're definitely at that age where you are not cynical yet, at least not most people. I mean, there are a lot of cynical young people who are like completely disillusioned with the world, but a lot of people that I meet are very genuine, caring people. They're concerned when they see, something negative happening, but they are very easily trapped into like human rights discourse, which is inevitably a kind of universalistic European and Western, like, yeah, it's a Eurocentric discourse, unfortunately. I think that plays into everything at the end of the day. Like, I think we have this ability to perpetuate American exceptionalism in a very unfortunate manner in terms of like the limits of our critique. I mean, even just thinking in like um, every kind of like discipline of activism, if you want to call it that way, in terms of like, are you a climate activist? Are you a gun violence activist? Like, even the way in which we kind of put ourselves into these boxes, people like to have their niche and they like to understand like what they're working towards and the contours of their activism. So even with like climate activism, if you were to critique someone for advancing the Green New Deal and say like, well, what about American imperialism? What will happen to it with the Green New Deal? If you want to bring up lithium in Bolivia, or whatever kind of criticism, I think a lot of people immediately are like, if they're even able to like comprehend that there's something outside of the United States, it's very difficult for them to process what a world without American extraction and control and American hegemony would look like, and how you can even build things in that. Because I think they take that for granted. Like, America is in power irrespective of what I do. So I'm just going to focus on making my life marginally better. And I think that ends up with like internationalism being a very difficult thing to actually express. And I think, Merrick, I know we've talked a lot about this, but I feel like internationalism is almost, if imperialism is like this highest stage of capitalism, and internationalism is a high form of activism. It's one of the highest we can do in terms of, like you said, very, very broad horizons for what you're trying to do on a global scale. It's very difficult to convince people at your university you're thinking about, like, how, if you're not like a rich fraternity bro who just like loves living there and has a great time, a lot of students are like, well, what about, the fact that I hate the dining hall, and I really hate how much homework I get, or whatever. And it's like, when you begin to point out, for example, our at Cornell, like, we've been doing research about how our school is on stolen land, participated in the colonization of the Philippines, in structural adjustment in Indonesia, in the occupation of Palestine, etc. And you can really go down the rabbit hole with every university in America. I know that the mapping project has that for universities in Massachusetts, but a lot of students, I think, are like, but what can I do about that? Because at a certain point, the answer is a kind of like, you can't reform your university. You have to acknowledge that universities play a role in capitalism and imperialism, and with those, they have to be abolished, for lack of a better, understanding of the problem. And I think as students, we're in this point where we're kind of like reliant on the university. We need it, we're here, we've invested so much into it, we just want a job out of it. That to think about what a productive sort of pedagogical alternative could be, a productive alternative organizing space outside of the limitations of the university, is very impractical for a lot of us. So I'm just reflecting kind of on what you were mentioning, of like why students don't want to mobilize beyond the immediate imperatives of their life. I think it's definitely a problem of education. I wouldn't be so cynical and say every student doesn't care, because then we wouldn't be having this conversation. But it's so difficult to convince students to say, like, your needs are important, but what about this kind of like international perspective that you're missing, of how your university participates in settler colonialism at home, imperialism abroad, and trying to get people to think about ways to oppose that is one of the challenges that we're encountering. But I don't think it's impossible. I think there are strategies to awaken people to those options.
As we're kind of wrapping up, I know normally at the end of our discussions, we like to ask our guests, like, what are some of the readings that you've been doing recently? Like, what kind of recommendations you have for people, and also, what projects you're working on, and like how people can support them as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm working on hella projects right now. But I guess the main one I'll plug is getting involved in the Cuba Solidarity movement. Um, if you have a Cuba Solidarity group, near you locally, I highly encourage you to join it. If you want to find that, you can go to nnoc.info. That's our website, nnoc.info, and we have a list of all our member organizations across the country. So you can join and you can participate in caravans and standouts against the blockade, and educational events, and also to organize to bring people to Cuba. At that same link on that website, you can find information about different delegations and brigades to Cuba around the year, since I know it's really hard with student schedules to find a time. We're also really, really excited to be this year investing a lot more in fundraising for youth scholarships. We're hoping to raise like tens of thousands of dollars so that more working class US youth can come to Cuba than ever, because that is just a huge priority for our group. And now, like, I'm excited to be in a position of leadership to, like, have a youth directly working on this. So if people are interested in going to Cuba or in joining any of those groups, check out that website. People are also always welcome to DM me if they need help getting involved. And if you don't have a local group, I'd encourage people to start their own if they have the capacity, or you can definitely get involved virtually. There are lots of like activities that are still happening remotely. There's virtual pickets and caravans, and also, a lot of political education that needs to be done online. In terms of reading, it's called Che Guevara Talks to Young People, and it's a collection of Che's speeches that he gave to young people. And a friend of mine who was selling books at our NNOC fall meeting this weekend recommended it to me, so I bought it. and it contains my favorite Che speech, which is called On Revolutionary Medicine. Also, the title is sometimes referred to as Child of My Environment. And I read this speech first because when I read the Motorcycle Diaries by Che, it was like an appendix, so it was at the very end of the book. And reading this speech was like definitely my biggest like aha shift moment, because Che talked about how growing up he was a child of his environment, and his ideas and his orientation towards how we can, make change in the world were all defined on his own, upbringing and kind of like bourgeois, petty bourgeois surroundings. And only when he, went out and saw, the impacts of capitalism and imperialism and colonialism did his view actually change. And he realized that to be a revolutionary doctor, first you need a revolution. And that I won't spoil the whole speech since I think I want people to read it. But to me, reading that, I read it right at the beginning of my senior year of high school, and I think everyone should read it, but especially, as you're, at this kind of age where you're like figuring out what you want to do with your life, and yeah, like taking your next steps and just like growing up. I think reading that and thinking about your orientation in the world, and not just, achieving your own accomplishments, becoming, in Chase's case, like the best doctor in the world, or the most revolutionary doctor in the world, but to see yourself as part of something bigger, and to see not just our roles as individuals, but how we fit into history, and how what we choose to do with our lives can be a part of that, and can be a part of making change is really important. And I think learning some of those ideas is the reason that today, like I'm doing this work still, and I hope to be doing it for the rest of my life.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Merrick, I don't know, do you have any last thoughts? I think that was like a perfect note to end it on, but
Just wanted to say that we really love Che Guevara here at Cadre.
yeah.
Uh, Joseph, you should talk about the quote that we like, the Cadre quote, and then you can just wrap us all up.
Yeah, I mean, I even just like hearing about that book, I feel like I came upon it one time, because we have like read stuff and used it. I mean, we talked about obviously a lot like the Motorcycle Diaries and kind of like narratives of waking up from a bourgeois background, if you want to put it that way, or but obviously Che kind of represents something very special from that perspective in terms of an alternative pedagogy, like a radical pedagogy. Um, and even just like reading his work to like write stuff on the website or use it in personal activism. I think when we were naming the group, to think of the cadre, he also has an essay called "The Cadres as the Backbone of the Revolution," and he talks about like what even is a cadre as a kind of uh, a unit of learners, or kind of like students, people who are uh, attaining a political education in order to do the necessary work for the building of the revolution. And yeah, I think for us as students, I think that's kind of the perfect summary of it. As learners, as young people, we're, I think, as we've touched on in this conversation, kind of emerging from a background of learning that is highly ideological, but we don't necessarily pick up on that as we're growing up. We're not really aware of ideology until we learn later on that, every ideology is a class ideology. And when you're exposed to American education, when you get up and say the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning at school, or, learn and talking about class, and we could go, I think, for hours talk about like high school education as like a very, very indoctrinating experience, being in an AP government class together, which I think is probably the most reactionary class I've ever taken in my life. And we took econ too, and it was like AP Gov was like, these are America's enemies. This is what we want you to know about them. It was like almost like you're being debriefed for your CIA mission, and they're like giving you the short report quickly, like what you need to know about Iran, what you need to know about China, what you need to know about Russia. Go out, go into the field, and go and do our work. And it's like a very brutal process to kind of wake your mind up from that. But I think in terms of like reflecting on education as a goal, as a tool of praxis, I think it's very, revolutionary to kind of understand how education can be manipulative and indoctrinating, but also how it can be emancipatory. So from that perspective, I really enjoyed talking to you. And Merrick, I don't know if you want to close it off.
I think you guys both really ended it well. So I wanted to say thank you so much for coming on and taking some time for us to talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Definitely hope to do it again in the future.
Awesome. Thanks so much.